After following 4 different pitmasters on how they trim brisket, it's time for me to combine their methods to show you how to trim the perfect brisket for your backyard barbecue like a pro. And I'll include references of my sources throughout the video, including links to their channels in the description below. So for tools, I'm using this cheap $6 boning knife from Mercer, and I sharpened it with the Chef Master knife sharpener. So if you need either of these tools or any of the other barbecue tools I use in this video, make sure to check my Amazon affiliate links in the description below. So before we even begin trimming, the first step is picking the brisket. So I'm gonna show you a few things that I'm mindful of when I'm brisket shopping. So the first thing I look at is the mohawk. So for most of my cooks, I like to keep the mohawk on because it can produce the best bites on the brisket. So make sure the mohawk is intact if you plan to keep it, because sometimes the butcher will cut it off. Secondly is a tip I learned from Texicana BBQ, which is to make sure that the fat cap has no bald patches. This is especially important if you're gonna cook fat side up, because these patches will create moisture pools and it will ruin your bark. But as you can see, my brisket does have some red patches on it already, but I'm not planning to cook it fat side up, so it doesn't really matter for me. Now on to the trim. So our first tip comes from Mad Scientist BBQ, which is to put the brisket in the freezer for about an hour before trimming. This allows the fat to harden, so it's safer and easier to trim. Okay, so once the brisket is opened up and patted dry, I like to start on the fat cap, which is the tip that I learned from Wilson BBQ. So the reason why it's important to start on the fat side first is because we want to make sure that the fat is as hard as possible while we're trimming it down. That way it doesn't melt and get slippery in our hands. So the first cut I'm gonna do on this brisket is what I like to call the Chuds scoop, which is to scoop out the fat below the mohawk or ear. So this removes a big hunk of fat that we're not gonna eat anyway, and at the same time it opens up the brisket so that we can really work on this mohawk. So the next thing we're gonna tackle is the actual mohawk, which is this big lump of meat right here. So normally I remove all the fat from under the mohawk, and that leaves just a big flap of meat on top. So I usually prefer to do this for backyard barbecue because this fatty point meat gets bark on both sides and it just creates these incredible bites of brisket. However, because there's no fat to protect the meat, you really have to baby this mohawk. So you're gonna have to watch it, spray it, and even sometimes foil it early to make sure that it doesn't burn. However, I'm planning to cook this brisket on the Weber Smoky Mountain 14-inch, so the plan is to cook the point at the bottom grate. And that video will be out in the very near future, so if you don't want to miss out, make sure to subscribe. Anyways, since I won't have access to the mohawk on the lower grate, I'm just gonna remove it completely and then cut down the fat underneath it. So the next step is to shape the brisket. So the first step is to make sure that the brisket is laying flat before we cut, and then I'm just gonna cut straight down from the mohawk and also on the other end opposite from where the mohawk starts. This will help make sure that the flat cooks evenly and also removes any thin meat that would burn through the cooking process. Then I go ahead and just round out the edges of the brisket so those don't burn either. Next, I'm gonna remove all the fat on the cap to about 1/4 of an inch. And as I go, I'm gonna be doing a Jirby BBQ trick, which is to make cuts on the brisket to look inside to see how deep I'm going. This will make sure that I don't scalp the fat cap. But even if I do scalp it, it's not the end of the world because again, the brisket already came with patches on it, and on top of that, I'm cooking this fat side down. Also, while I trim the point side of the brisket, I use another Jirby BBQ trick, which is to take my hand and make a crease right next to the mohawk. That way I know how far the meat goes and I can use that as a guideline as I trim. Now it's time for the lean side of the brisket, but before I flip this thing over, I need to say that if you found this video helpful so far, make sure to give it a like. So for the big piece of decal fat, which is opposite side of the mohawk, I like to shave this down rather than carve it out. This is because the fat helps to protect the burnt ends on the other side of the brisket, because usually this side of the brisket, I have it facing the inside of the cooker, so it's a lot harder to spray and baby that side because I can't really reach it. Plus, as I said before, the point is gonna be cooked on the lower grate of the Weber Smoky Mountain 14-inch, so I'm gonna need all the protection I can get. After that, we trim off the silver skin. Now, I like to use a tip that I learned from Harry Soo, which is to use your offhand to lift the brisket and create an arch. That way it's easier to trim off the silver skin and it's also safer. And the final trick I do is from Mad Scientist BBQ, which is to cut a corner of the brisket against the grain of the meat. That way I can give myself a reminder of how to cut against the grain once it's done cooking. And there you have it, a beautifully trimmed brisket done like a pro. So I hope you were able to follow along, and if you enjoyed the content, click the next video on your screen and I'll see you guys on the next one. Later.